their seats, that would be brilliant, as we will be starting the panel soon. Thank you all for coming. If anyone outside feels like coming in, it's going to be a great discussion. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to this important panel about the Land Gap Report. Before we begin, I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Michaela Loach. I'm a climate justice activist, co-host of a podcast called Yikes, and author of It's Not That Radical, Climate Action to Transform Our World. And I'm super honoured to be here today with authors of the Land Gap Report, which is what we'll be talking about for this. And I will briefly introduce our speakers before I give a quick introduction. So Kate Dooley is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne and the lead author on the Land Gap Report. Wim Carton is a researcher and lecturer at the Centre for Sustainability at Lund University and a co-author on chapters 1 and 2 that looks at the mitigation challenge and the scale of land-based carbon dioxide removal expected. Dr. Anne Larson is a principal scientist and team lead for governance, equity, and well-being at the Centre for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry, and led Chapter 4 on rights of Indigenous people and local communities. Virginia Young, from the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society, together with colleagues from Griffith University, was a co-author on Chapter 3 on primary forest ecosystems. And Stanley Riamit Kimaran, founder of Indigenous Livelihood Enhancement Partners in Kenya, was also a co-south on the land rights chapter and will be providing closing remarks reflecting on the discussion that we'll be having here. So I'm sure that some of you maybe have an idea on what the Land Gap Report already talks about, but if you don't, it's a really important report because as on a panel that I was on earlier this week, my friend Eric said that all climate justice work is climate work, but all climate work is not technically climate justice work. And this report is really important because it shows us what can happen if we don't center justice in the solutions that we're making, because it's not just about a moral question, it's also about the fact that it doesn't make sense if we're not including justice in the actions that we're doing. So a few important points on the report is that it identifies countries' climate pledges put unrealistic demands on land. It calls into question the ability of countries to achieve their climate pledges, and it highlights the need for fossil fuel emitters to urgently phase out rather than use land and forest to offset emissions. So with current kind of commitments that have been made, there is commitments to land that would compromise Indigenous rights and is pretty ridiculous. So we'll be talking about that, and I will now pass on to Kate, who will be introducing the report and talking about the calculations that went into it.
Okay, thanks very much, Michaela. So I'm just going to briefly, and it looks like the video is going to cover some of our slides, but that's okay. There's not too many numbers in them. So I'm going to briefly just introduce the results of the report and the methodology, what we did and what we found out. So next slide. So the results, what we've done in this report is quantify the area of land that would be needed for carbon removals in existing country climate pledges. So only only carbon dioxide removals that rely on land, and I'll go into the different types in a minute. And we're not talking here about when countries pledged land for protection of existing forests, protection of existing ecosystems. We're talking about carbon dioxide removal. So we found 1,184 million hectares, that's almost 1.2 billion hectares of land, would be required in these pledges, up to 2060 the pledges go. And of this amount, it's important. So this is a really large area of land, and that's what's important about the findings of this report. It's actually it's almost equivalent to all of global cropland area. It's bigger than the area of the United States. So this raises a lot of concerns, and that's what we're going to hear about from the rest of the panel. What does this mean to have this area of land potentially being used for carbon dioxide removal for climate mitigation goals? But before, or the important context to think about when we think about the findings here in terms of a very large area of land, is that only, or just over half of that area, 633 million hectares, would require a land use change. So this was pledges from countries to reforest, to plant trees, to plant plantations, to extending existing forest areas. So 633 million hectares of land that are not currently forested are pledged to become forested. Now, we think that is a concern because that land is being used. People live on that land. People grow food on that land. It could be done in ways that's good, but it could be done in ways that's very risky to people, to livelihoods, to Indigenous people's rights, as the other panel members will expand on. But another half of the results, or just under half of the results, is land for restoration. And so this is where countries talked about restoring degraded forests. Sometimes they talked about reduced forest harvest to do that, or removing existing causes of degradation from forests. A lot of reference to restoring rangelands, restoring degraded rangelands, mangroves, other wetlands, but really a lot of mangrove restoration is in NDCs. And agroforestry, silver pasture, some references to that. Most of these references for restoration, or the more detailed ones, tend to be in the NDCs of very vulnerable and developing countries, where the agriculture sector is so critical to those countries, to the livelihoods of people in those countries. That's where we tended to find really detailed and potentially quite good plans for restoration of degraded lands. Whereas the sort of tree planting and forest expansion tended to be in the NDCs or net zero pledges of countries with high emissions, you could say. So the UK, Australia, the US, Saudi Arabia, had high areas of tree planting and land use change. So we think that's interesting. Countries with higher emissions that they need to reduce rely more on land use change. So here I'll move over this quickly, but we have on the website, not quite yet, but by tomorrow probably, you'll be able to see an interactive database to see the results. So you'll be able to click on a country and it will show you the pledge type. So we've divided the pledges into land use change and restoration. Now there's actually, you'll see in the report, there's more detail. We categorise the pledges under 7 different land use activities in order to do this, but we've just simplified the results here. Some countries had both land use change and restoration, some had one or the other, and no data often meant that it was not quantifiable. There were 55 countries where we couldn't quantify the data, but the rest we actually could. So we looked at all the countries in the world, and what we're looking at actually is net zero or long-term strategies, mid-century strategies, and for countries that didn't have those, which is most countries, we then looked at their NDCs. And if there was no land use in NDCs, for some countries we've also looked at official government documents. And then just to wrap up sort of this introduction of what we found in the report, we're putting this in the context, okay, so we're calling this the land gap because we think that the amount of land pledged in NDCs is more than realistically could be available for that land use change component. So you can see what we've done here is there's a generally agreed planetary threshold for the area of permanent cropland. This comes from the Lancet report as well as the planetary boundaries work of Will Steffen and others. And that's 1,500, the FAO is reporting this year, last year really, 1,500 million hectares of permanent cropland. We're adding our 633 million hectares of pledged land use change we found on top of that, and that also includes 81 million hectares of land for BECCS, which Wim will talk about what that is. So this contributes, we're already over the planetary threshold for permanent cropland. This contributes to it if this land use change contributed to that sort of land area through indirect land use change, through other things like that. And this figure compares that also to the projected agricultural expansion area. That's a big range in the figure. It's always hard when the plane goes overhead. And the projected area of BECCS. So we've just actually compared it to the projected range for land that would be needed for BECCS in very low overshoot pathways. So that's kind of the smallest range we can get for BECCS. And already from just 7 countries, there's 81 million hectares of land. So we would expect that to grow quite a lot. I'm going to finish up there. I've probably taken too long and pass on to Wim.
Thank you very much. I think I might as well just stand here from now on. But yeah, thank you very much for explaining through what the report is. And I think everyone who's sitting here, whether you work directly in land or in other spaces, this is really important for all of us to be reflecting on, because evidently, I mean, other people will speak on this a bit later, but it seems like it's a new form of neocolonialism, the way that land is being kind of used. And I will pass on to Wim, and I'm sure there'll be more reflections from other people as we go on.
Great. Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me now. I'm going to start actually, oh, yes. I'm going to start with, you can go to the next slide, with an observation that we've had for the last, I guess, 2 or 3 years, significant concern by civil society on net zero corporate pledges, about the integrity of those pledges. And now we have evidence that, you know, this critique, this concern has gone mainstream. The Secretary General went out the other day on record saying that these net zero commitments have loopholes wide enough to drive a diesel truck through. So there's an increasing recognition that this is a problem. And this goes not just for non-state actors, as is in the report that the Secretary General was commenting on, but also for countries. And the problem is not just that there's loopholes or that corporations are not living up to their pledges, but also there's structural problems with net accounting as such. And that's basically, I think, what the land gap report is pointing to. So if we can go one slide back. So you're all aware, I'm sure, of what net zero is and what net accounting is. So we're essentially talking about a balance between continued sources of emissions and removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through various methods. And the aggregation of those two is what is a net zero target. When you reach a balance between removals and sinks, with removals and continued emissions, you have net zero. Now the problem is that very often net accounting obscures what exactly that balance looks like, how much of each is in that target. And the reason that this matters, and now we can go to the next slide, please. The reason this matters is that there's very different ways of getting to net zero. Net zero can look very differently, and I just used this image that I'm sure most of you have seen, which is from the special report on 1.5 degrees from the IPCC in 2018, that illustrates some of these different pathways. And we can talk a lot about, you know, these pathways. They're certainly not exhaustive. There's other futures excluded from this and so on. But I think they illustrate quite nicely that, you know, each of these 4 indicative scenarios reach 1.5 degrees, but they do so in very different ways. And the gray area above the zero level there is what is essentially, you know, total aggregate emissions. And then everything below the bar is aggregate removals. And so we can reach essentially net zero by having quite a lot of continued emissions long into the 21st century and then balancing that out with quite a lot of carbon dioxide removal throughout the rest of the century. Or, as in the first scenario, we could have a scenario where we have relatively little removals and a much steeper reduction in emissions in the near term. And which of these future visions that we end up with, of course, matters a lot. It matters in terms of justice, it matters in terms of environment demands placed on water and other resources, biodiversity. It matters in terms of when peak warming occurs. It matters for all kinds of different reasons, political economy, etc., etc. So carbon removal adds a whole different level of risk and complexity to the mitigation challenge. So essentially what these models show and what also the country pledges then do is that net accounting allows for significant substitution of carbon removal for emission reductions. Essentially means you can continue using fossil fuels longer into the future the more removals that you enter into your net zero target. And I think what the land gap report nicely does is show that this is not just a concern that is happening in models, it's already happening in country pledges as well. If we can go to the next slide. So why is this a problem? I'm just going to list some of the kind of main problems with large-scale carbon removal here, and I'm focusing on problems not because I'm a doomer, I'm maybe a little bit of a doomer, but because some of the other panelists will talk about the good ways in which one can do removal, and of course there are good ways as well, but there's 2 points here. There's a lot of economic incentives to do carbon removal in a bad way, and it not only matters how we do carbon removal, but also what we use that carbon removal for. And so there's 5 concerns that I briefly want to touch on. The first is that land-based carbon removal cannot compensate for continued fossil fuel emissions. Scientifically, that does not work. And the main reason is there's a significant difference in the risk of reversal with leaving some fossil fuels in the ground versus storing carbon in nature-based carbon sinks. The latter are at a very high risk of reversal over the kind of time period that we're talking about, certainly if we take into account the increased risk of climate change. And then obviously, as the land gap report also shows, the land simply isn't there because it's already being used. Secondly, there's various risks and negative social and environmental side effects with each of the carbon removal technologies that one could talk about. And I'm not going to go into specific technologies, but Kate talks about BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is one of the technologies that has been dominant in the modeling of this. So essentially, it's you use biomass to generate electricity, for example, and then you put a CCS installation on it to capture that carbon, and you put it underground, and essentially that's a way of kind of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And the extent to which it is being deployed in models would essentially have an enormous land demand as well. And there's all kinds of other CDR technologies that I'm not going to touch on, but each of them come with their own kind of set of risks and potential side effects in terms of water, biomass use, etc. The third one, and this is where we get to how CDR is being used, right? CDR, sorry, is carbon dioxide removal, by the way. They can become an excuse to further delay emission reductions. And this is often talked about as a hypothetical concern. And I think it's very clear that this is now more than just a hypothetical concern. I mean, some of the kind of, civil society work that has been done in exposing how net zero, how corporations are going about setting their net zero targets and basically using removals to justify continued investment in fossil fuel, etc., show that this is already happening. And as Kate also said, the fact that the countries that some of the countries mostly interested in doing tree planting, for example, are also the highest emitters, also illustrate this tendency. Fourth is that carbon removal in many ways is still a speculative technology, so it might in the end just not work at the scale that we assume it does, and when it does not work, we lock in warming and then increase the burden in terms of emission reductions and adaptation. And fifth and finally, there's of course a risk to human rights as well, depending on how carbon removal is being deployed, because CDR itself might allow, as I already said, continued emissions, but also because of the direct effects of specific technologies. Large-scale tree planting, for example, might lead to land grabbing dispossessions. So just to briefly sum up before I turn it over to Anne, we see net accounting creating opportunities to shift responsibility and burden onto the land sector. This has enormous risks. There's concerns to be raised about each of these technologies, and the land gap report just illustrates that these problems with net accounting are not just hypothetical. They don't just exist in models, but they are actually already demonstrated in country pledges as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wim. I think that's really important to point out the kind of creative accounting that happens with a lot of these pledges, as if we can continue business as usual, when in fact that's not the case. And it is the fossil fuel industry who absolutely love carbon capture and storage and the idea of it, because it would allow them to continue for much longer. And I think that if the fossil fuel industry loves anything, it's probably pretty bad, and we should be opposing that. So I will now pass on to Dr. Anne Larson, who will be speaking to us about land rights and Chapter 4.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So just to reiterate what is obviously clear here, land can't be the main climate solution. It needs to respond to too many other needs at the same time: food systems, biodiversity, local livelihoods, local cultures. What we need is a major paradigm shift in the way we seek to solve the global climate crisis. And that new paradigm needs to not only be effective in addressing carbon emissions, but also to be just. If we want to transform the way we live on the planet, patchwork solutions like tree planting are not going to work, and they definitely aren't going to work for the indigenous peoples and local communities and farmers living on rural lands. It's not a just or acceptable solution if land-based climate pledges make even poorer the indigenous peoples and local communities who've been good stewards for the land and forests and the other resources we need for survival. Evidence shows that forest lands that are legally held by communities exhibit lower rates of deforestation, store more carbon, harbor more biodiversity, and benefit more people than lands managed by either public or private entities. The pledges, as they're currently written, can't be met without including the customary lands and territories of indigenous peoples and local communities, because there just isn't enough land available. So why is this a problem? Because many of these land-based pledges don't take into account either the amount of land actually required, the competing needs for the land, or the people who already live there. History demonstrates that this simplistic land and forest-based solutions, which are not only unrealistic, are likely to perpetuate deep injustices against indigenous peoples and local communities. First of all, indigenous and community land rights are still insecure and therefore subject to challenge. While indigenous peoples and local communities exercise customary rights to at least half of the world's lands, less than 20% is formally recognized as owned or designated for the rights of communities. You can see this in the graph here. This means they're vulnerable to the surging global demand for land. The climate pledges, as well as lots of others that aren't included in this report, for biodiversity, restoration, biofuels, all increase competition for land. Second of all, when we look at history, we don't have a very good track record. The history of indigenous and community land rights is a history of dispossession and marginalization. Only recently have there been some significant initiatives to secure land rights, but they pretty much need to be described as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Throughout the world, recognition of indigenous and community land, rights to land, resources, and territory has been limited, partial, and fraught, marked by competition, opposition, and even violence, as well as capacity and funding gaps and elite capture. Strong local governance institutions are key, as is the defense of territory that's facilitated by rights recognition and by allies. The Kayapó territory in the state of Pará in the Brazilian Amazon, an island of green in the midst of deforestation all around, demonstrates how strong governance institutions have allowed them to protect the borders, defend against land invaders, ranchers, miners, and loggers, and prevent forest fires. Strong governance systems, support for defending their territory, and strong alliances with collaborating civil society organizations, donors, as well as key allies in government make this possible. So indigenous communities in general continue to face a number of challenges. The biggest ones are probably resource competition and outright opposition to their rights. This includes economic development models that put profit above human rights, and we might add ongoing fossil fuel extraction. Another problem is expert-led conservation and management initiatives that see local people as the problem and insist on top-down solutions. This includes the fortress conservation that we have in the past under a number of protected area policies that force local people to relocate. But it can also include restoration sometimes and other conservation initiatives that put sometimes biodiversity goals above the rights and needs of local populations. There are also other difficulties, even when there's political will and really positive efforts to secure land rights. There are bureaucratic problems, logistical obstacles, capacity and funding gaps. And finally, another major obstacle is elite capture and inequality at the local level. The failure to see the process through and support it in a way that that avoids the benefits being usurped by a privileged few, sometimes in ways that the rights don't reach communities at all, but also failing to understand the diversity of what a local community is. The potential for stewardship, for the protection of our remaining natural forests, is so much greater should these peoples and communities receive support for their stewardship, grounded in genuine participation, secure rights and access, and locally embedded solutions, co-designed to be context-specific, flexible, and adaptive. We've heard a few times at this conference that we have enough pledges, that we really need to move forward to implementation to see progress in climate action. And this is absolutely true. But we have to move forward in the right way, with credible goals, with a clear understanding of the system transformation we need and based on the adaptive capacity of Indigenous peoples and local communities. This means moving away from current emissions-intensive food systems towards agroecological systems that support both ecological and social resilience and are grounded in human rights and local agency. We argue in the report that the most effective and just way forward for using land-based carbon removals is to assure that Indigenous peoples and local communities have legitimate and effective ownership and control of their land and adequate opportunities to represent their own interests and engage on equal terms, ultimately exercising self-determination in the pursuit of actions that directly or indirectly affect their lands, territories, livelihoods, and collective rights. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. And I think it's really important that we realise that we have an opportunity here with any crisis. Arundhati Roy wrote about the pandemic being a portal, and I think that we have that opportunity with any crisis. We can choose to hold the baggage of the old world with us, or we can step lightly into a new world and transform it. And I think that this report has shown, we can use this. I don't know if there's any other campaigners in the room, but loads of scientists have worked on something that we can then use to really show the transformation that's possible and really use to put pressure on and cause transformation. And I think that is within our reach, and so it's important that we do that. And it's not just about knowing the things, it's about also like, what do we do about it next? And I hope that people are scheming in your heads as to what we can do. And I'll now pass on to Virginia Young, who will be speaking on Chapter 3 about biodiversity.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Chapter 3 takes a look at the bleeding obvious, namely protecting and regenerating what we've already got. And it looks at the most important of all the terrestrial ecosystems for the health of the biosphere, namely our primary forests. And that's primary forests in each biome, not just tropical, includes temperate and boreal. Next slide. So the numbers on your left, I think, the one that says 151 and 320. So 151 is the below ground carbon and 320 is the above ground total carbon, a total carbon of 471 gigatons. That's for primary tropical forests. That's greater than all the fossil fuel emissions since 1750. So if you want to understand why forests are important for climate mitigation, take a look at those numbers. They're very large. Temperate forests are the most depleted of all our forest ecosystems. We've lost a third of the world's forests, and only a third of what's left is considered primary forests. But in the temperate ecosystems, which are mostly in developed countries, the loss is even greater. And if you look at the figures for the boreal, you'll see that huge stores of carbon are actually in their soils. And when you look at the landscapes of forests in the boreal, the figures are even higher. I think it's something like 270 billion tonnes of carbon stored in the fens and peatlands of the boreal. So these primary forest ecosystems, their most important function for climate mitigation is to keep the carbon they've got. It's the same argument as fossil fuels. You want to keep fossil fuels in the ground. You want to keep the carbon stored in primary forests in those forests. The consequences for achieving anything like 1.5 degrees are profound unless we do end deforestation and damage, loss and damage to our natural forests. So the primary mitigation value in primary forests is their retention value, the carbon retention value. They do continue to sequester carbon, so the myth that you have to chop trees down so you can sequester more carbon is just that, a myth. The science is very clear that primary forests continue to sequester carbon while ever they're alive, and that big old trees sequester around twice as much carbon as smaller trees. So most of the carbon in primary forests is in big old trees. It might sound like a no-brainer, but we don't have a system in the UNFCCC that actually recognises the value of that carbon retention. We have a set of accounting rules that focus on annual fluxes. Guess who that suits? It suits both industrial logging interests and also fossil fuel interests, because that's the basis on which fungibility has been, if you like, constructed. So really, sort of the accounting shifts that are needed and the information that's really needed to inform decision-making around primary forests is information on their integrity and their stability. What we must avoid at all costs is tipping points in these systems where they convert from primary or natural forests into some other lower carbon, more vulnerable ecosystem. The other thing this chapter looks at takes quite a close look at restoration potential. And again, the conclusion is very clear that the best thing that you can do is allow secondary natural forests to regenerate, to recover. Most secondary natural forests are between 30 and 70% below their natural carbon carrying capacity. So they've got the potential. They're a huge proportion, in fact, of the forest estate, and they've got the potential to store very much more carbon if they're well looked after. Next slide. Thanks. I think there's that. This is just a little slide that demonstrates differences in integrity and stability between three broad categories of forest condition. So monoculture plantations, which are all the trees in straight rows, low intensity, high risk of loss, and relatively, modest carbon storage. The middle slide is secondary natural forest. They're in the middle on all those factors. And the further graph, the picture, is an illustration of primary forests, which are high integrity and very low risk of carbon loss. So when people talk about tipping points in ecosystems and forests, what they don't often refer to is that risk of loss differs depending on the condition or integrity of your forests or your ecosystem. And the last slide. Now, we've heard a little bit about the CIFOR territory. There it is. So part of the project that I'm involved in has a case study with the CIFOR. This is an image of what happened to the CIFOR territory, or what didn't happen to the CIFOR territory in the Brazilian fires. You'll see the heart-shaped bit in the middle, that's the CIFOR territory. Most of that territory is relatively intact. It has closed canopy, it is in absolutely robust ecosystem integrity. And guess what it does? It doesn't let the fires in. Then the last two severe fires in Brazil, the fires entered on the more fragmented side of the CIFOR territory that you can see there. There was some fire entry, and some of the Cerrado actually burnt as well. But 10 million hectares of the primary forest in the CIFOR territory, the fire did not penetrate. That's because Primary forests store more moisture, they have bigger trees, and they are absolutely more resistant to fire. And that principle applies in all ecosystems. It applies in the temperate. The boreal is a bit different. But these are critical factors to consider as drought and fires increase with climate change. The more we fragment these forests, the more we degrade them, the much higher the risk and severity of fires rapidly increases. And we saw that in Australia in the 2019-20 fires, where there is now absolutely clear scientific evidence that younger forests increase fire risk and fire severity, and that older forests still resist fire and help put them out. And I think that's about all I'll say. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Virginia. And everyone will be having a Q&A at the end, so please do start thinking of your questions. I want loads of questions, so I'm hoping that everyone will be writing them down as we speak. And to close, I will be passing on to Kimaran to give some reflections on the panel and some closing statements. But before then, I think I really wanted to just highlight again the opportunity we have to create a better world rather than a worse one, and that is really within our reach. And so it's important that we realise that so much transformation is possible, but a lot of that is restoration of and maintaining the rights of peoples all over the world, which is something that Kimaran will be speaking on now.
Good evening all, and initially when I was told to speak last after such a distinguished panel, I contemplated saying, they have said it, let's go home. But somehow, because I'm a panelist, I have to find something to say. And I'll try to say it. So, one is that, and from them, I benefited, I'm hopefully wiser speaking last. So the evidence is out that current land-based emission reduction pledges is built on quicksand. It's built on quicksand because it is not only unsustainable and expensive, but such land actually isn't there. There is no such thing as idle, unowned, unoccupied land. So it simply says, implies land use, implies dispossession, implies displacement. The second point of reflection hearing them out is that indigenous people and local community ecosystems are currently storing the highest carbon stocks. Those storing these high carbon stocks, they aren't just receiving minimal support in terms of resource allocation, but more seriously, as clearly articulated by Anne, they are threatened by a lack of recognition of forest and land tenure rights. This is despite evidence in the study that in the case of Latin America, there was a case study of some region, the indigenous people land stored twice as much as land outside indigenous people territories. Third is that this insecurity of land tenure recognition is a serious risk to our aspirations of biodiversity conservation, climate resilience, and livelihoods well-being. Fourth is the proposed mitigation actions, such as, for example, RED that are forest-based, and the new LEAF one that seems to be fashioned in the same way as RED. In the context of such land tenure insecurity, they remain a mirage because of the contestation of land tenure rights in these spaces. So the low-lying fruits with promising results at relatively perhaps lower costs is securing the forest and land tenure rights of indigenous people. And specifically for Africa, and I think Anne spoke to this, only 20% of this land is recognized and given to the right holders. 75% of this land, for example, which is communal under customary tenure, is not recognized. Bottom line, we must address inequalities around forest and land tenure security. We must address inequality around voice, around knowledge systems, that the highest biodiversity concentration is indigenous people's hands or territories is not accidental. It is based on their value system. It is based on their traditional knowledge system of positive nature relations. We must address the question of human rights in order to have a decent, realistic chance of realizing our aspiration. We also must look elsewhere, not just land-based removals. We must address the elephant in the room, and that is addressing our over-reliance on fossil fuels and transforming our food systems. The blind accumulation of more than we need and wastage, and move towards agroecology, embracing the philosophy of indigenous people, of sustainable livelihoods, taking only what you need from nature. And finally, we must avoid the path of dispossession. We must avoid the path of displacement. We must not reproduce a history of dispossession of indigenous people's rights as highlighted by Dr. Ann. At the very least, we must not punish the relatively faithful stewards of nature who represent places that have become the lungs of planet Earth, trying to inject a balance because of the emissions elsewhere. They have the lowest carbon footprints, and we must not, in the quest, in the name of net zero, dispossess them. Rather, we should place resources in their hands to adapt and mitigate to climate change, to enable application of these indigenous knowledge systems and practices. I come from a community where it's taboo to cut a tree across. If the medicinal part of a tree is in the back of a tree, you cut a slit vertically because they know cutting across is suffocating the tree. If the active ingredient of a herbal medicine is in the root, you don't go around one tree removing all the tap roots, all the roots. You remove from one and you move to the other so that there is another tree tomorrow to rely on. And I want to stop by saying we need to put human rights, indigenous peoples in the face, at the center of these climate change discussions and decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if I might humbly add something before we take some questions, one of the biggest threats that environmental defenders face across the world is the policing and prison system. And that's something that I don't think gets challenged as a climate justice cause enough. And I think that focusing on abolition and understanding abolitionist ideals and how we can transform the world and not hold on to kind of the same carceral logic and logic of depossession, logic of like harm that has got us into this place is something that is a climate solution as well, and making sure that we protect offenders also means challenging the same systems that harm them. And I would like to just encourage people to read into abolition a bit more. There's lots of really brilliant work on that. So now, does anyone have any questions? You can start putting your hands up. We have some lovely, wonderful humans running around with mics. So please do raise a hand. We've got a couple over there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, quick technical issue. Oscar Vargas from Transforma in Colombia. Thank you very much for this very impactful panel. I get the chills. I just had a very quick question regarding the cities, whereas the report actually considers these other solutions like green roofs, green walls, and to what extent can these initiatives, or maybe even urban agriculture, help as initiatives for carbon storage, or if we're talking more just on the rural landscape? Thank you so much.
Who'd like to take that?
Yeah, so what we've, I mean, in the quantification part of the report, we're sort of not considering anything. We're just quantifying what land pledges, land-related pledges countries have put forward. And there was very small references here and there to what you're talking about. But then in the other chapters of the report, when we're putting forward solutions, we did have a chapter 5, agroecology, if we don't have a representative on the panel. And to some degree, what the urban green roofs, urban forestry, that sort of thing, it falls in, well, it can be considered an agroforestry practice. There's many papers on it quantifying the potential carbon benefits, and the actual, the per area sequestration can be very, very high, although the range is very large. I actually spent a little bit of time trying to include agroforestry in some other papers I've done where we look at the potential of ecosystem restoration, including agroforestry, to contribute globally to climate goals. And it's incredibly hard to quantify because it's so varied. The practice is so varied. But I think the agroecology chapter did focus more on rural landscapes, smallholder farmers and livelihoods and that sort of thing. So there's not that detail on what you're asking about in the report, but it's definitely a really beneficial and important sort of intervention. Did you want to add?
Does anyone else want to add anything? No? Brilliant. There are 3 hands just over in the same cluster.
Okay, thank you. My name is Alphonse Molo. I'm a PhD from University of Copenhagen and University of Nairobi. So my question is on the mechanism, the how, in terms of affecting the rights to indigenous community to land, because from experience, yes, we have part of it through the Community Land Act in Kenya that gives access right to part of the community. But then we find the challenge where initially they were gazetted as a forest, and indigenous people are totally removed from them. So then it gives an opportunity that vacuum, when the indigenous community were evicted from the forest, it gave an opportunity to some of the elite to go ahead and subdivide the forest. So when the indigenous are told to settle, then they settle as squatters, but it's a way of enhancing or facilitating that kind of accumulation to elite. So that's the biggest challenge in terms of this. And at times the experience is when you bring in new laws and new institution, then at times it doesn't meet the end target of protecting the forest as we may want it to achieve. Thank you.
Did anyone want to respond to that in any way?
Thank you very much, Omolo, and I think the case sounds very specific to the Kenyan context. Yes, so certainly recognition is one step. Policy recognition is one piece of the jigsaw puzzle. In the context of Kenya, for example, you have a law, you have a constitution that is positive on indigenous community land rights. Communal collective ownership is recognized. And then you have an enabling legislation that actually translates the principles of the constitution into how this land will be recognized. But then problems begin in implementing. There are no resources to support the demarcation process, the registration process. And so yes, the law came in 2016. That is 6 years ago, and we only have about 9 communities that have registered their community land. So we have to cover the entire spectrum. The second issue with the forest is that there are historical land injustices, and I think in every indigenous people landscapes, there are historical land injustices that remain unaddressed to date, sweeping under the carpet. We can't confront and deal with them. And until we confront and deal with these historical land injustices, investment in such land will be unstable. They will remain contested. And while, again, we have a historical land and injustices clause in the Constitution seeking to redress, a policy to establish corrective action did not see the light of day. And the issues remain unaddressed. And this is the experience of indigenous forest peoples in the country. Last is also mechanisms of consultation with these communities. Right now, it's become politically correct, 1, to have an indigenous people policy, 2, to have free, prior, and informed consent. But you give free and informed consent, and you don't give resources to implement this consent in decision-making arrangement when dealing with indigenous people. So I think we need to look at the entire spectrum, the history, the policy, the practice, the resources, the decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a few more questions over near the back. Is someone?
Thank you. My name is Johanna von Braun. I work for the International Land Coalition. My question is about the degraded land figures that you put up there. That's a large amount of land that is considered degraded. What sort of land are we talking about here? Is this empty land? Is this totally degraded land? Is that land that is in partial use? Can you speak a bit more about that? And also in terms of the carbon sequestration potential of the different ecosystems. You mentioned mangroves, rangelands, etc. Is there some that hold greater ecosystem, I guess, or sequestration potential compared to other? Thank you.
Oh, there's a follow-up question here. Is there that we can add? We can combine questions.
Just related to that, my name is Rukshana. I work for the International Land Coalition. So just want to know the definition that we have used in terms of land, because particularly degraded land, forest land, and abandoned land have been defined in a way to exclude people who have been living in those land or relying on that land, and just to exclude them from in net zero and carbon offsetting programs, to exclude them from any kind of management program and their inclusion in it. So just want to ask, degraded and plus, how did you define land in this context? Thank you.
Okay, that's great. I've partly forgotten the first question now, but hopefully I'll get back to it. I can ask you to repeat. So and I'll try and start with the first one, or I'll further forget it. So we didn't define the area of land that was degraded. It's a little bit similar to my answer to the last question. This is what we found in countries' climate pledges. And so when the area of land that I said that is countries have pledged that would require restoration, sometimes that is being referred to by the country as degraded land, and sometimes it's not. But for the most part it is, because land needs to be degraded to restore it. And when I say land, I mean forests, agricultural lands, mangroves, other kinds of ecosystems. So it covers all range of natural and managed lands. And partly, part of the work here was in, as I said, we had 7 land use categories. So obviously we had to simplify what countries had said in their pledges in order to quantify it. But I think the value in this work, and I forgot to say at the start, so the value in this work and what we wanted to do was show that these often abstract carbon removal pledges that are sometimes given an area of land, but often given in just amount, gigatons of carbon that will be removed, or million tons at the country level generally. That abstract carbon removal figure actually translates to a physical area of land on the ground. So we've quantified it to try and do that. Now, it's an imperfect methodology because country climate pledges, as anyone who has looked at them will know, are very vague, very different in the ways different countries say things. There's no sort of coherence or comparability between them. So that aside, to sort of get to your question, so we've taken, when countries have said restoring, one thing that was referenced a lot as degraded was rangelands, so restoring degraded rangelands, and some countries had very large areas of what they called degraded rangelands. Restoring degraded mangroves was another one that was mentioned a lot, a little bit wetlands. And then forests, we counted it as degraded if it was clearly not protection of a primary forest, not planting a new forest, but they were planning to sequester carbon into a forest by sort of reducing logging or reducing some activity. So sometimes it was sort of an exclusion to get that category. So that's sort of how we found all the categories. If I haven't answered your question, come back to me. But then in terms of defining it, so as I said, we're not defining the land as degraded, but it's incredibly relevant and correct what you said. Often countries think that this degraded land is land without people on it. But I think actually what in the way that I categorize the activities in the report, when land is being restored in these, so the degraded lands that were restored, say for rangelands or for a lot of agricultural lands were mentioned, then it didn't seem like people were going to be displaced there because the land use wasn't going to change. And so that's why we think the other category of land where it's reforestation. So what land is the country planning to use to reforest? They don't say that. There's nothing spatial about these pledges and there's nothing spatial about our results. So we don't know where this land is. You asked about amount of carbon. I remember now, sorry. So there's nothing spatial about it. So it's more a risk that countries will perceive land as degraded and reforest it. If it looked like that's what they were going to do, say with their degraded rangeland, then we would have counted that as tree planting, as reforestation, and it would be in the land use change category. It stayed in the restoration category if it seemed like the land use was going to stay the same. So degraded rangelands, we counted that as silver pasture, and then that is sort of mixing livestock and trees, increasing tree coverage in grazing areas, and so there's still a use of the land. But yeah, very, very important point you made. In terms of the amount of carbon in the different land use activities, yes, that's why we categorised what countries talked about in their land pledges into 7 activities: young forest, old forest, plantations, silver pasture, agroforestry, mangroves. And for each, and the reason we use those 7 activities is as IPCC default removal factors to give you the amount of carbon sequestration per hectare of land area. And so that's how we quantified the land area based on slicing everything up into those 7 activities. And yes, the carbon amount, the carbon sequestration potential of those lands vary. Mangrove restoration is the highest by far, and the next would be plantations, as opposed to restoring degraded forests or planting new forests. There's also different emission removal factors per biome. So this is also categorized into whether it's in tropical, subtropical, temperate or boreal biomes. But what's interesting in this is that plantations have a higher removal factor, and these are IPCC default values. Obviously it varies more than that. Then, say, reforesting with mixed native species. And so that can incentivize a country to include plantation, or to call the activity, or to sort of pledge that they're going to do plantations because they might think they're going to get more carbon sequestration from that, even though it's much more damaging than other forms of land restoration. And that's effectively what Virginia was talking about in terms of we need to incentivize the right kinds of land activities, not the ones with potentially the highest carbon sequestration. So sorry, that was quite long, but I think I did cover everything.
Thank you very much. Is there another question in that area? Yeah, we've got owners on over there as well.
Hi, I'm John Bonifacio. I'm from the Philippines, part of Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment. Just wanted to share as well that in the work that we do as in the Philippines, like it's very clear that the fight for land sovereignty is very much central to ensuring that we have a proper solution to the climate crisis, because with the farmers and indigenous peoples we've worked with, it's clear that land, having stewardship or having their land rights is really one central way of allowing them to pursue these kinds of interventions that help address climate change. I just wanted to ask to the panel, anyone can answer this, based on everything you've said, what are the specific recommendations to the UNFCCC that you think should be pushed for by campaigners, since this is such a, what I feel like is a very critical or crucial piece of scientific evidence towards the sort of actions that we want to pursue? And then maybe I would also like to ask for your comments on specific policies like the REDD+ that are being pushed, and how you think this factors into this kind of like the kind of approach that states are taking when it comes to these carbon dioxide removal projects. Thank you.
Who would like to speak on this one? Virginia?
Yes, okay. I'll deal with the last one first, the REDD+. We're still losing about 3.5 million hectares at a minimum of primary forest a year. So REDD+ has not helped. I mean, if it has, God knows what. But you'd be aware of a lot of the there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about the failings of REDD+, and several reports that have been prepared, but the real proof is in the very limited impact, if any, on preventing deforestation, particularly when it's in fact fostered industrialising forests in a way. Previously, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for instance, was encouraged to essentially put logging coops all over their forests so that they could then claim additionality when, for preventing something that was kind of an artefact in the first place. So REDD+ is a very strange mechanism. I'm sure there must be some good examples somewhere, but most of what I hear is not very positive. I'm sorry, what was the early part of your question? I've forgotten that now.
General recommendations based on all the...
Well, look, just from, my perspective is on what we need to do to tackle the climate and biodiversity crises, and we know we have to protect what we've got first, and that's a pretty strong message that needs to be given here. Actually, COP26 last year was the first time we ever had a COP decision that mentioned the word protect. It is the highest priority action for natural ecosystems, including natural forests. And there is almost nothing that Kate found in the analysis of the NDCs that showed any real focus on allowing secondary natural forests to recover, which would be the next highest priority. I happen to be on the board of two really major landscape scale connectivity restoration programs in Australia, and what we focus on is buffering and reconnecting existing natural areas, working with landholders and supported by landholders. So you can find, lots of landholders want to do the right thing. They want to improve the outlook for biodiversity as well as the health of their farms. So there's a lot of potential, particularly in developed countries, that everyone seems to forget about. One of the recommendations in this report is actually to look at how you utilise things like connectivity conservation initiatives to work with communities to buffer and reconnect and improve the integrity of existing natural ecosystems, as well as recover a whole range of ecosystem services. The big change that has to happen here for land, forests and other ecosystems is to have an holistic approach. It's not a story just about carbon. It's a story about every ecosystem service that land and ecosystems provide, and it needs a more holistic approach, even to accounting. And there is a new one. There's a new ecosystem accounting framework that's been developed by the UN Statistical Commission that could provide really useful, fill a lot of critical information gaps for all the Rio conventions, in fact. So there's a lot that could be done, a lot of basic principles that could ensure that restoration activity actually works for communities, biodiversity, carbon storage, carbon sequestration and storage, and all ecosystem services. And that's where we have to head all the conventions, in my view. Thank you.
I'm just going to add a couple of really quick points onto the end of that. So, yeah, the broader accounting issues Virginia is talking about are really important. Specifically to this COP, some of the, I think, implications from the land gap report, first are around for the GST. Broadly, they relate to the need for more transparency. So we need more transparency in government pledges, what they mean when they're talking about land use, what they're counting on in terms of removals from land and what land area it would require. It was really, deciphering what was in these in a fine-tooth way instead of governments just transparently saying what they're going to do. But this has implications at this COP. In the global stocktake, we can't have a stocktake of collective progress towards our goals when it's so intransparent what amount of the goal of the pledge is from actually reducing emissions and what amount is from removals. So we need to separate out the emission reductions from the removals in the way that countries put forward their pledges and in the way it's assessed in the global stocktake. And the second really important one, I'd say, and so I just can't stand the plane going overhead. It was such a good idea to build a conference venue in a flight path. So the second really important one, and there are many, but these are the issues I'm following, I guess, is related to the Article 6 negotiations. Now, at the moment, under 6.2, we've had some discussion about, from parties, wanting to keep a confidentiality clause in 6.2. So when they're in their registries, in their trading of units between countries, they would keep information confidential. Now, this is completely unacceptable, and this is what I'm talking about with transparency. We can't have these land removals quantified, traded between countries, and that data being considered commercially sensitive or confidential. So that absolutely cannot stand in 6.2, in Article 6.2 negotiations. And there are other implications I could talk about, but that's a couple of concrete points for you.
Thank you very much. And there's another question just over there. Oh, there's one near the front. And oh, there's a couple. Yay, everyone's very engaged. That's wonderful.
Can I add something?
Yes, thank you so much for this great panel. I'm Alexandra Depré from IDRI in Paris. And my question was, I guess a couple of you touched upon the point of the report is really, well, what you presented, but I guess it has also implications for the IPCC. So following up on the question on recommendations for the UNFCCC, I was wondering if you could touch upon what are the key, like, urgent recommendations you would have for the IPCC and reform, given that we're also moving to the following cycle. Thank you.
Who would like to take this one? Oh.
I actually wanted to add my voice to the first one, if I can. Yeah? Yeah, so I think one recommendation again to the global stocktake, the evidence is here that the richest and high potential forests, primary forests, are the highest potential for carbon sequestration. And these forests are in the hands of indigenous people. And the Paris Agreement, at least in the preamble, has human rights, including the indigenous people's rights, and has indigenous or traditional knowledge, again, in 7.5 for the Paris Agreement. But when you look at the global stocktake, which the approach of capturing issues is around guiding questions, which are ultimately synthesized into a synthesis report. There's no such questions around human rights and traditional knowledge. And if this question is missing, certainly there's no way it will find its way to the synthesis report. So here, I think they should certainly consider this thematic area, guiding question on human rights and traditional knowledge, so that it's reflected that these forests that are of high carbon sequestration potential remain relatively stable. Thank you.
Thank you. And Wim, do you want to follow the next one?
On the recommendations to the IPCC, I mean, it's an important point. It's also, I guess, a tricky one. I was just in the Global Stocktake session this morning. I was interested that Saudi Arabia was referring to the IPCC and the science to argue that, you know, oil and gas are a considerable part of the energy mix long into the 21st century. And I mean, you see these references to the science and the science justifying, you know, large-scale removals all the time. You know, they come at varying numbers, but basically these scenarios that the IPCC has produced become very, you know, very kind of powerful kind of tools to justify this kind of narrative. So, I mean, immediately, right, I think there's a lot of recognition of this in the scientific literature, I think. There's really a need to kind of, I mean, first of all, communicate that, you know, the IPCC itself would say that, you know, we're not truth machines. We heard that at the panel yesterday as well. These are just projections. They're not predictions, you know, so you can't even use it in that way. That's the first thing. It's about communicating. A second is to just open up, you know, the kind of pathways that are being produced. Currently, you know, we're talking about cost optimization models. It's mostly a techno-economic future that is being envisioned. Often environmental concerns, justice concerns are not a significant part of that at all. So, I mean, you know, much more could be done to make that explicit and build those into it. But I think fundamentally, the biggest issue for me is just that there's a very particular kind of knowledge that is dominating in Working Group 3 in the IPCC, right? And that is coming from this kind of modeling work. And it's really about, I think, broadening the kind of perspectives that are being used to, you know, create these kind of visions of what alternative climate futures could look like that are not just dependent on integrated assessment models, but use a variety of different epistemologies, a variety of different methods, and come from a variety of different perspectives and disciplines. And I think that would be a much more kind of inclusive approach to doing that, and would help overcome some of these fundamental issues that are, you know, there with these scenarios.
Yes, from my perspective, the IPCC is starting to skirt around some of these issues. So for the first time, Working Group 3 recognised or said that protection offered the highest mitigation value, both in total and per area of any action in the AFLU sector. It recognised the irrecoverability of carbon lost from carbon-dense ecosystems. It mentions the high synergies between biodiversity and greenhouse gas abatement in primary forests and other primary ecosystems, but it doesn't then kind of do anything with it. So, and when I say it's skirting around, it hasn't got to the heart of the issue here, which is an issue around risk. And the links between ecosystem integrity and minimising risk of loss. And that's the key missing piece in the UNFCCC. It's actually a missing piece in all the Rio conventions, but it's critically important here because it goes to the question, the fundamental question of the stability of your carbon storage in what you do in land and forests and ecosystems. So that is a missing piece that I think the IPCC needs to address. It might, I mean, I don't think the Land Gap report specifically mentions this, but the follow-up from the IPBES IPCC workshop ideally should be a special joint report from IPBES and the IPCC on the synergies between climate and biodiversity loss, but also the unpicking that functional role of biodiversity for ecosystem stability and lowering the risk associated with carbon storage in land, forests and ecosystems. They have to understand that much more. The integrated assessment models certainly don't give it to you, and really having land chapters that aren't holistic is kind of pointless. It's just so this stuff is not divisible. So the sooner that's recognised and some bridges are built between the conventions and we start thinking about solutions in a holistic way for communities and for nature, the better off we're all going to be.
Thank you very much. And I think we have about 10 minutes left, so we can take a couple more. I think you've been waiting a wee while, and there's someone over here after.
Thank you very much. My name is David Howell. I'm from SEO BirdLife. We're the BirdLife International partner in Spain. And firstly, I'd like to add my thanks and congratulations to this panel for the quality of the interventions, the clarity of the messages, and for the moderation. In the EU, we're reaching really the final stage of negotiations on a whole host of legislation looking forward to 2030 to try to increase ambition. Amongst that is the LULUCF regulation reform. That gets us into these questions of how do we set a target for natural absorption of carbon out to 2030, and how do you do a share out between countries going from tundra to really desert, semi-desert, desert landscapes, and all of the transition in between. As I work in Spain, I'm particularly, of course, interested in the Mediterranean ecosystems. And it would be great if, from the panel, you were able to give us some pointers on where you think we should go specifically on these ecosystems, which are really in the front line of the increased intensity of fire risk, but not just fire losses, which is, of course, a natural element of these ecosystems, but drought, heat, disease, and storm losses we're seeing increasingly within Spain. And with it, just to keep on that example, the projections in the Spanish long-term strategy are that we're going to progressively lose absorption capacity from our natural carbon stores out to 2035 before they start to recover in some kind of post-transitional state. So this is a pretty worrying scenario. If I can finish this with one final remark, it would be great also if you're able to give us some pointers on how this report helps us with the two key concepts of stock and rate in all of this. Thank you very much.
So this is a big question. We have 10 minutes left, and there were still a few hands up, so I'd like to answer it kind of quickly. I'm sure everyone could actually add more things in, but
we can have a separate conversation, David.
It could definitely be a separate conversation, but just briefly, I think, yeah, so with the new EU, the LULUCF regulation and the removals target, it's important to realise there's already an existing framework of legislation in the EU that can guide how to actually achieve that. And in particular, the forest restoration law. There's other regulations in process, and I'm a little bit rusty on my EU laws because I'm not working on that now, but I think there's also the common agricultural policy actually has a role to play in, there could be reform there to drive more incentives for restoration. And so I think the legal framework is in place in Europe. It's about using it in the right way, and in particular it's about perhaps not getting distracted from existing really good regulation like the forest restoration law and the healthy soil strategy and the CAP into something like a carbon market crediting mechanism where suddenly we only focus on the carbon and therefore the flux into these ecosystems, as you're saying, rather than the stock and restoring those stocks. So that is definitely where Europe needs to go. There's already a lot of papers, publications and studies showing how much carbon could be increased into Europe's forest stocks in particular through reducing the intensity of forest harvest and set-aside areas, increasing the areas of set-aside, and also particularly you said Mediterranean, agroforestry has huge potential in Europe as well. So that's the short answer, but it's a big question.
Yeah, and developed countries have a huge potential. They've done most of the damage and they have huge potential and a very willing set of community players as well. So there's, what we have to ensure is that all of this so-called restoration and monocultures of trees doesn't land fairly and squarely on top of developing countries.
Thank you. And probably one last question, or maybe two. I think I have about 6 minutes. 3 minutes, so half as much as I thought. Do you want to go? I think there was a hand here before.
Mine was just a clarification question, Virginia. You said 3 million hectares are deforested every year. Do we have a sense of where the bulk of that deforestation is coming from? And could you kind of elaborate a little bit on that? Thanks.
A heck of a lot comes from Australia, but well, I could find out more precisely for you. It's about 3.5 million hectares. I saw that challenged actually in the previous panel, that these are figures that the report uses, I suspect, from the FAO, but the figure that was presented in the panel that Tim Turchington was on was up to 10 million hectares, so I'm going to query that. But the university that I've been working with has done a major global forest mapping project, and so I can get more precision around where.
I have a couple of minutes if there's one quick question maybe, or I can just wrap up. Yeah, go on. And everyone can find the report at landgap.org, that's right? Yeah. And the interactive map will be on there soon. Everyone can have fun clicking on all the countries. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, it's Peg Putt. I'm with the Biomass Working Group of the Environmental Paper Network. I just wanted to possibly make an observation rather than a question. I'm just going back to the initial couple of presentations and how there's been this assumption that you can just get rid of megatons of carbon emissions somewhere without actually saying where, and how terrifying it is that it's so much more than is actually there or available, let alone what it's going to do to ecosystems and to people. And I thought it's really rather analogous to the thinking around economics that had the environment as an externality. In this case, the land and the people there are some sort of externality that doesn't get properly drawn into the NDCs and sort of make coherent thinking about what is being promised to be done. And we need one avenue we go down with the argument is therefore there's not enough, you need to reduce your fossil fuel use, which is absolutely true. But the other thing I think we need to do is just keep stressing you've got a whole lot of things that that are in your thinking are externalities that actually need to be brought into your equations and your thinking, and we need to drive that critique quite hard at the parties. So I just wonder what you thought of that.
I think yes. No, I'm not going to elaborate on that. I think that is exactly right, Peg. We do need to drive this hard. And I really liked how you phrased it, that it is quite terrifying that all these removals can be assumed in a country NDCs. That will be included in the global stock take and the aggregate and our projections for going forward of whether we're on track to meet our target or not. But are we going to achieve those removals? Countries aren't really going to actually probably reforest that area of land just as well, but then we also fall short of our targets. Yeah.
So I think we're going to wrap up in a second, but I actually wanted to ask a question, if that's all right. So obviously this report has shown that countries' climate pledges rely on unrealistic amounts of land-based carbon removal, almost 1.2 billion hectares. That's ridiculous. What can campaigners do, like someone like me, for example, who is like a young climate justice activist? What would you want us to be doing with the information that you've got in this report? Like, how do we act on it? Anyone can answer.
Look after what we've got first. I mean, do things that are good for people and good for nature. You know, like there's simple kinds of messages that can be framed around this. And, you know, plastering the planet with imaginary trees is absurd. And I really liked your point, Kate, about the need for transparency in the global stocktake about exactly what has been pledged and where. And, you know, we've got we're sort of trying to get in through CAN, the concept that ecosystem integrity matters for the viability of a lot of these pledges. So that's one thing. But protect first, restore second, you know, the simple messages like that would be really good.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for this panel. Thank you everyone who came along and asked questions and listened. And please do check out the Land Gap report on landgap.org. Thank you.